So let's look at the supplies that you need to prep a canvas with gesso. Now if you have a thick variety of gesso like that, you are best off using a brush that's meant to be used with gesso, and those are brushes with very stiff bristles. If you don't have a brush like that, you could also use a palette knife to apply the gesso onto your canvas. If you don't have a palette knife, the next tool that you could use would be a acrylic painting Taklon brush with bristles like which have a spring, so they're not very soft like watercolor brushes. So let's look at this gesso. Now this product, so that's just the normal gesso. This is a bit gooier and thicker consistency than the other product that I have here, which is the colored gesso. So you can see it's much more fluid than that one. So this one, ideally you would apply a coat, let it dry, sand, and then repeat the process once. Okay, with this one you do not need to sand. So let me show you how I'm going to do this. To use this product also means that if you have a canvas that's headed for the bin and you want to actually reuse the canvas for a fresh painting, this is the product I would recommend. Okay, so step number 1 is where you're going to apply gesso with an applicator. You might need more than one applicator. In this video I have used a palette knife to apply the thick gesso paste onto the canvas, and then I've used a flat Taklon acrylic painting brush to spread it evenly onto the canvas. Having done that, if you end up with lots of extra gesso on your canvas, it might be handy to use a squeegee to scrape out the extra gesso, and to finish off the layer of gesso that I've just painted, I have once more used a Taklon brush to paint vertically and then horizontally to get as much a smooth finish that I could possibly get. On my left, what I have is a shop brought pre-primed canvas. On my right, I have the canvas that I'm priming with my gesso. So the aim is to for this project is not so much to get the whiteness of the canvas at par with the shop brought one, but to cover up the painting below and get a relatively white surface which is ready for a fresh painting. But the technique remains the same if you are using a unprimed canvas fabric or unprimed canvas. So do take a note of that, that the technique remains same. So in this next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand the canvas in very gentle let me remove that, gentle circular motion, because I'm using a very fine Taklon brush, but if I were to use a stiff hog bristle brush like that or special gesso brushes, then perhaps the streaks would have been more prominent. But all I'm trying to do is get a nice smooth surface with less tooth for this particular project. If you were to require a canvas which requires more texture and more tooth, then you don't need to use a sandpaper to get a smooth surface. The way to sand a canvas in the middle of in between coats of gesso is to use a very fine grit sandpaper. So when you go to the shop, I'm using something that's number 150, but you could use one that is like that. So it's a dry sanding paper with that number there, but I'm not going to mention or get too fussed with the numbers, because essentially what you're looking for is a sandpaper that is very fine grit and mostly used for getting the final polish or used in the final polishing layers of any kind of project like a woodworking project. Okay, so circular motions, I'm going to go with that one. I might fast track the video here just so you can have a look at how I'm going to finish sanding this surface. So once you've completed sanding the gesso surface or the painted surface, what you're going to do is give it a wipe with a clean lint cloth of some sort, just to get rid of the extra dust. And then you're going to add another layer of gesso, but this time just using a brush. Ensure that the layer of gesso is thinner than the first layer was. For the final step, we are going to need to sand the surface again. Now, a point to remember is if you're using an unprimed canvas, for the final layer you would need to use another coat of Gesso Universal Primer, or just a conventional gesso. But because I am using a primed canvas and the aim here was to hide the painting underneath, I'm going to use a colored gesso, okay, for the final coat. But before we apply either of these materials, the next step, we need to sandpaper and get rid of any undesired textures or tooth on the surface of the canvas. And it's quite white. Let me just show you compared to that, and that's the off-white one which I just did. If you know, you cannot see any section of the previous painting that was underneath. So that's how you prime or prep a canvas with gesso. That's how the canvas looks, nice and smooth. So that the final coat, as I mentioned before, was applied with a colored gesso, and the first two coats were applied with a Gesso Universal Primer. Now, what I used here was 2 coats of gesso and then 1 coat of colored gesso. But if you do not have a colored gesso with you, you can use that product, just a normal conventional gesso, to have 3 layers painted. Remember to sand in between layers and clean once you have sanded the gesso, just to make sure that there's no loose grit left in between layers of gesso that you apply. For the final touch, I'm pretty happy with it. You'll note that in my case I wasn't using a unprimed canvas. I was prepping a primed canvas because I had a painting underneath it that I didn't want to complete. So this method is fantastic if you want to reuse your canvases and paint something over an old painting. Perhaps you've made a mistake and you want to get rid of the whole painting. Instead of binning the canvas, you can just gesso over it and put a layer of white paint, just so you have something that's pretty close to a brand new canvas for a fresh painting. For those of you who plan on using paint markers of any kind, whether it's an unprimed or a primed canvas, I recommend putting a layer of gloss medium on top of the gesso, the gessoed layer. What that does is the gloss medium is going to add 1 more layer of smoothness on your canvas, and that's going to protect the tips of your paint markers from getting damaged, because a primed canvas will have tooth, which to the naked eye isn't much. It's just the weave of the canvas fabric, but the tips of the pens can be ruined if you're using them directly on the canvas without the gloss medium layer that I mentioned about. So if you're not going to use a paint marker and you're just going to paint over it with simple acrylic paints, then you don't need to do the step. But since I'm going to use some paint markers in this piece, I will be putting an additional layer of gloss to finish off prepping the canvas for painting. That's it from me today. Bye for now.